Welcome everybody to Fidelio's webinar, Board Performance Reviews, Trends and Impact. We're delighted to welcome you here today. This is proving a lively topic, and I'd like to take you through our agenda today and also give you a little bit of context. Before I come to introducing my colleagues, let's move to the next slide, please. So this is what we propose to discuss today, a brief introduction on where we are with board reviews, board performance reviews, then looking at the investor perspective, then looking at some sort of structural trends in what's happening in terms of how board reviews are being structured, as well as what we're seeing as priorities, and then moving to some high-level conclusions. So next chart, please. Just to set the context, and you'll be familiar with this, most jurisdictions today for listed companies are recommending, with varying degrees of emphasis and prescription, external board evaluations. And you'll see that there's sort of a different language, a different focus in different markets, but it has become a commonality across listed companies, and most codes will refer explicitly to the board evaluation. But I guess we have seen in our practice a lot of focus, a lot of discussion, a lot of attention to how the board review is developing. And that's the focus of today's webinar. Next chart, please. I'm delighted to welcome today two of my colleagues who work with me on board reviews internationally. I head the practice, and I'm joined today by Alistair Stranack, who's a partner in our board practice with a particular focus on strategy, and Hans-Christoph Hirt, who's an advisory partner, and again with a particular focus on shareholder and stakeholder engagement. And as you probably noted from the previous chart, our work is very international. And so today's conversation, much of it will refer to the UK, but much of it will be referring to board reviews internationally as well. Next chart, please. Just to give a little bit of context, our focus is the board, and we support boards through reviews and evaluations, which are the focus of today's call and discussion, but also board composition, succession planning, skills matrix work, and board development and board learning. And one of the themes I think that we take from today's discussion is that interconnectedness is becoming more and more important, and particularly, for example, the connection between composition and board reviews. Next chart, please. Another theme of our work, which again I'd like to tease out a little bit today, is the focus on the collective judgment, the judgment muscle, as we call it, of the board, and that sort of collective capability for good judgment, sound decision making. And that's clearly a theme that's underpinning our work, but also really coming out very clearly of the board reviews we're conducting. How do boards build that muscle? And it's a theme that we'll return to. Next chart, please. Now, before we hand over to my colleagues, I'd like to just turn to the audience, to our participants today, and ask you to vote on a poll question. As I said, we're seeing that the board review is both subject to discussion and change as to how it's being implemented, and we'd welcome your perspectives. So we've set a poll question. Firstly, in your view, is the periodically conducted external board review, one, primarily a regulatory requirement which provides important comfort to shareholders and stakeholders? Or secondly, in the first instance, is the board review a useful tool to enhance board effectiveness, i.e. primarily for the benefit of the board? Or thirdly, is the board review a board intervention that is morphing completely, given the pace of change, including technology developments, into something very different? So I'm going to open up the poll, and I'm going to ask, I'm afraid we can't vote, so my colleagues can't vote on this one, but I would ask our audience members to cast a vote on this. And we'll wait a moment while the poll results come through. I'm going to ask my colleague, either Annabelle or Mahi, to let me know when the results are through. Are we nearly there?
Yes, I'll end the poll now. I'll leave it for a couple more seconds.
Oh, well, this is really quite a clear answer. That was, which is always good, a definitive answer. So actually a big shift, I think, from the audience, because I suspect if we conducted this poll, even if, a couple of years ago, we'd have seen a bigger vote in category one towards sort of the regulatory and comfort for shareholders and stakeholders, but a resounding vote in favour of a tool to enhance board effectiveness, a tool primarily for the board. And I'm delighted to see that as an outcome. But also, actually, the third question, 20% feel that actually it's changing quite significantly. And that's probably something for us to hold on to as we move into this discussion and then come to the Q&A session afterwards. So thank you very much for that. And we'll come back to that later. Next chart, please. I'd now like to hand over to Hans. Now, Hans, I'll leave Hans to say a little bit about his background, but really a very eminent background with regard to that interface between institutional investors and the boards of companies that they invest in. And Hans has also worked with us on board reviews, and so has sort of seen both sides of the equation. And I've asked Hans just to walk through what institutional investors are expecting from the board review. So Hans, if I may hand over to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Gillian. Thank you very much. And this looks very complicated, and we will get to the slide, but maybe just starting, I've been with global investors for 20 years, Federated Hermes, and then UBS, and in that role, as an investor, engaged literally with hundreds of boards in the UK, in Europe, in Asia, in the US, on everything, starting from strategy, leadership, board effectiveness, and also on several occasions on board evaluations. And I should say in the beginning, I'm a strong supporter of high quality board evaluation or reviews. The UK code calls it formal and rigorous board evaluation. And actually, we have encouraged them, both when I was at Federated Hermes and UBS, as sort of almost as a tool, serving two functions: one internal, working on the board effectiveness and showing this willingness of boards to enhance, but also as and I will use this word repeatedly, as a governance quality signal to investors. Let me briefly explain why, in coming to this chart, the so-called governance triangle, where you have the board overseeing the governance of the company and looking at strategy, looking at leadership, risk succession, and capital allocation, and ultimately long-term value creation. Then the relationship with the CEO and the top team is quite clear, with the appointment, oversight function, and holding the CEO to account. And then on the left, you have the investors, and clearly investors also play a very important role, but they only have the election tool once a year. Then they can engage with the board and committee chairs and the senior independent director. But critically, there's a structural limitation, and the limitation is simply that they are outside the company, and they're certainly outside the boardroom. So they can look at publications, they can look at board composition, they can look at individual profiles, but they cannot see what actually happens inside the boardroom. So the change really is to a board evaluation. is that a good board evaluation can go a little bit under the hood and go literally inside the boardroom, speak to directors, look at how meetings are actually conducted, and that brings a very different flavor to it. So why is this important? A rigorous and credible external evaluation can really go where investors cannot go. I think ultimately it's as simple as that. For investors, that really means two things. One, it's the first function is it helps boards to review work on their effectiveness and enhance board composition, but also how board works. And the other really important function, it gives reassurance to investors that the board is doing this. And I have just 5 points on the next chart, please, to a little bit elaborate on that point. So we covered the first point, high quality board evaluation. Simply is a strong signal. You can use this as companies to saying that you are realizing there's potential for board development in almost every board. A second is, as I mentioned earlier, external evaluations can go where investors can't go, and that's as simple as that. So they have a different function and add something to the individual engagement investors, of course, do with chairs in the conversations they have. Then we have I have observed, Fidelio has observed this trend that actually chairs are using now evaluations not to tick the box, but using them when it really matters, when there's changes in strategy, when there are transformation, when there is a CEO succession topic, when there is perhaps recalibration of risk appetite. So we're seeing a much more strategic use of board evaluation, where really a chair comes in saying, I have something we want to work on. And that's quite an important change and reinforces this argument. Also, you can use this to signal as a company that you're working on the effectiveness of boards. So coming to something I have had many conversations with companies on reporting. It's an opportunity ultimately for you to say not just, okay, we've done a review, but this was a meaningful review, and there's sort of some essentials you want to disclose. I mean, who conducted it? What was the scope? Was it external? But then critically, it's also giving a little bit of flavor what the main themes were, what actions were agreed, and what the next steps are. And the best companies already doing this in reporting after external board evaluations, and that leads then to the final point I want to make. It's an opportunity for you to report what you have done and what you're working on, but it also then enhances the dialogue you will have with investors, because the most sophisticated investors would be reading what you report about the board evaluation, then pick up on some of the issues. That's certainly what we have done and what is being done in my experience. And so it's a real opportunity to use that signal, but also have a more informed dialogue with your key investors. And I'm sure there will be questions about reporting, but I think I hand over to my colleague, Alistair.
Thank you. Actually, I'll pick up on that, but thank you, Hans.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there will be questions. On the note of questions, please just use the chat function if you'd like to make any comments, but if you'd like to ask questions, we'll keep an open eye, and we will leave plenty of time for that afterwards on disclosure and more broadly as well. Moving on to the next section of the presentation, as I mentioned, we're seeing the structure of board reviews changing. And we've been thinking about sort of the drivers behind this. And I think one of the big shifts that we're seeing is almost a reappraisal of the value of the board. And it's quite a big shift in thinking quite broadly that the board obviously is a legal necessity and has a very specific role to play. But more than that, get it right, and it's a real opportunity. And we've seen this sort of shift in thinking from, a weak board is a risk towards a mediocre board is a missed opportunity, and an effective board provides competitive advantage. And I think this is where the board review, but more broadly, fits in, that we're actually seeing a shift from only focusing on the board when things go wrong, picking up perhaps on Hans's point and the external perspective, to really making sure that you have the most effective board, a high performing board, so that when challenges come or opportunities come, you're better prepared for it. And this shift in thinking, I think, has definitely flowing through to board reviews, and as I say, more broadly. If we move to the next chart, I think one of the big shifts that we've seen is that focus on the board per se. And it's not a given, perhaps, in this environment where regulatory frameworks are being challenged, and we're seeing divergence rather than convergence between major markets. In some ways, this is we're seeing a doubling down on the board. The board becomes much more instrumental because it's having to provide navigation, particularly for companies that are navigating different jurisdictions. And I think that's one of the drivers, and it's certainly something that we're seeing when we're working with boards of companies that are working cross-border, and potentially have sort of operations, subsidiaries in different jurisdictions. The second point that I'd like to make is that we've seen a very substantial uptake in board reviews by companies that are not necessarily required to conduct a board evaluation. So most obviously privately held companies, maybe private equity, it may be other forms of long-term ownership. But I think that's quite a testament to probably the outcome of the poll question, that this is a useful tool for increasing the effectiveness of the board, that we're seeing a very broad adoption of the board review, whereas 5-10 years ago, it was really predominantly in the domain of listed companies. And Alistair, I'm just going to hand over to you to add a couple of extra points there.
Yeah, there's three points I'd like to make in terms of what we're seeing, what some of the trends that we're seeing in board evaluation. And the first one here is, in the UK anyway, there's a requirement to do an external evaluation every 3 years. I think if you look at NASDAQ, they suggest you should use an external evaluator every year. But I think one thing that really is happening is that boards are increasingly looking at this not as a 3-yearly thing, but as a kind of 3-year program to enhance the board. And so they're thinking about, what are we going to do with the major sort of review every 3 years? And then how are we going to use the interim reviews between those 3-year reviews to really ensure that we're continuing to add value and continuing to improve the quality of the board. So we're seeing very often them talking about a 3-year board enhancement cycle, and having several interventions during that 3-year enhancement cycle to help improve the board. And the sort of thing that we're seeing here is, firstly, many boards are now capturing performance trends over that 3 years. So they start off with a certain level of performance assess, and they say, well, actually, we want to make sure we're getting better year on year. So let's capture those trends on an annual basis. Let's look at progress on some of the key initiatives, and if necessary, refresh them as circumstances change. And very often they're looking at kind of deep dives, so areas that were identified during the main review as requiring some attention. Sometimes we're being asked to come back in and do a deep dive into that area. So I think boards are thinking much more strategically about the process of board evaluation and the benefit they can get from it. I think the second thing which is related to that is something which was actually built into the 2024 update of the UK corporate governance code, and that's this change from thinking of board effectiveness to board performance. And so in quite a few boards, we're now seeing boards wanting to set themselves more explicit targets and key performance indicators in terms of what they set themselves to do. So as they would do with their executives, they set them a framework of KPIs and say, we will look at how we do against those over the next year or 3 years and see how well we are doing. And that's a trend that is coming in now into the boardroom. Secondly, we're seeing a much greater interest in benchmarking. So in many cases, particularly as we'll see a little bit later on when we look at some of the focal sort of issues that boards are looking at, boards are saying, well, actually, we need to be better at this. One good way of doing that is to actually look at or to benchmark ourselves against how other people are doing it. So either our peers or other boards in completely different sectors for whom, for example, the kind of oversight of technology or AI or something is well advanced, and they can learn from them. And there's it's much more frequently when we're doing evaluations, we're asked to explicitly benchmark areas of governance against other companies. And then I think the final point that we're really kind of noticing now is that whereas there was a certain shyness a few years ago or historically at using the board evaluation to evaluate individual board members, there's a much higher comfort level at doing that. Now, again, the code is kind of helping us with this because it's actually giving you an obligation to review individual board member contribution. But I think boards are getting much more used to the idea that that should be an important part of the board review. So we're seeing a lot of requests for peer review or independent review as part of a board evaluation of individuals, and that's contributing to the annual review conversations that each board member has with the chair. And it helps link kind of individual learning and development to where individual board members are. So it's a good way of improving the value of the individual board learning that the board members go through. So those are kind of 3 trends that I've certainly been seeing as we've been doing board evaluations recently, that the process is kind of tightening up and becoming more strategic in terms of the way boards are thinking about how they use the evaluation. Gillian, back to you.
Thank you, Alistair. And if we could move to the next chart, and I stand corrected, the Q&A function is being used for questions, so please do continue to use that. And as I say, we will leave plenty of time for the discussion of those questions shortly. So picking up on Alistair's point, what does this practically mean? And I just thought it helpful to run through the key components of a board evaluation and where we're seeing changes, developments, both in the individual components and how they're put together. Firstly, I think for an external board evaluation, interviews are standard practice, and I think they're immensely important. I think it's really important to be looking for open-ended questions so that you're surfacing both the key governance aspects, but also allowing topics to come to the surface. And I think this is an important element. The other point that we would make is the sequence of the interviews is really important in terms of really building up that rounded picture. And also the breadth of the interviews. Obviously, all board members, typically the executive committee as well. And I think in a number of the board evaluations, we're seeing really bringing in perhaps other executives that might have a particular perspective on the board, for example, the head of investor relations, and also stakeholders, and very often perhaps other advisors. And clearly, this helps to build that rounded picture. I add here quantitative surveys. Again, looking back 5-10 years, there was perhaps sort of a separation between an online approach and interviews. And I think nowadays boards expect both, quite rightly. But we see a very strong focus, and this is certainly our preference, for a very focused, succinct use of surveys. It shouldn't be simply outsourcing to the board members to spend a great deal of time filling these in. Really, really tight, really focused, but it is a means of shining a spotlight. And I think it's something that, we're seeing greater confidence in, and we're also seeing chairs and nomination committees interrogate the data that comes out of that. and learn quite a lot. And that complementarity between qualitative and quantitative, hugely important. Observations are becoming much more commonplace. I think in the UK they're absolutely commonplace, but also internationally we're seeing this being built up, and that's typically obviously the board meeting itself and committee meetings. Interestingly, recently we've seen a big focus on the observation of strategy days, and I think that's very helpful. It's probably, we'll come to that point in a moment, it's probably indicative, but it certainly helps to give an insight into both the immediate themes on the board agenda, but also that longer term thinking. A big change that we've seen, and we'll pick it up again later, is a much more dynamic focus on the skills matrix and succession planning. And I think this is probably reflecting the pace of change that boards and companies are subject to, probably higher turnover on boards, somewhat shorter tenures in many jurisdictions. For example, in the UK, the 6 years rather than the 9 years. But also a much more muscular use of the skills matrix. And unsurprisingly, I think technology and transformation are some of the drivers behind this. The review of board materials, really important to get to sort of a feel of the processes that and the quality of information that the board's receiving. So extremely important. And then one theme which we're seeing being used by a number of boards is benchmarking. And we think about benchmarking as building an understanding of how peers are tackling and addressing similar governance challenges and opportunities. So not a sort of a mechanistic approach, but really a bit of a deep dive into how other relevant boards are addressing very similar governance issues, what can be learned from this, and obviously, where there are strengths, where there are potential gaps. And I think those peer groups are often being defined internationally and often beyond sector as well. So I think that's also a trend we just like to address. And I think the overarching trend, picking up on Alistair's point, is this willingness to shape and structure a board review in a way that shines a light on the board, is most relevant for the board, and provides practical findings and recommendations. And so these are really building blocks, and I think that's how we would think about it, and that's certainly how we're seeing board evaluation, including with the effect of technology, developing. Thank you. And the next chart, please. And I thought it helpful, before we move on to the next section, just to summarize some of the key themes that we're seeing. We've talked about the structure of board evaluations, but some of the key themes that we're seeing coming up in the board discussions and in the board reviews. And so I'm going to hand over to Alistair just on the first of these, technology and the pace of change.
Yeah, we're going to share these little blocks as we go along. So the first thing was here you show we've shown some of the kind of key themes that we are being asked to look at as part of board evaluations. And one, I think, comes up as a company in every single evaluation that we have done in the last few years. And this is around, how does the board deal with technology and the kind of and the pace of change that technology is building into so many business models. So, where questions like the type of questions we're being asked to address is, does the board have the right skill set to oversee the development of use of technology? This is, I think, one of the reasons that the skills matrix and things are becoming much more involved in part of a board evaluation, because they're really wanting us to have a look and say, do we really have the skills? And if we don't, how can those skills be built? And there are quite a few options. So we're looking not only at, go out and buy in a board director with technological background, but also, is there a potential to use perhaps an advisory board as part of the overall kind of strategic review? And to what extent can board learning, or does board learning have to be built in? So in general, you don't need super experts on technology actually on the board, but you certainly need people to understand enough about what's going on and how to respond to that and where to reach out to. So, a lot of questions around the kind of board oversight of technology and what capabilities are required. Second area is cyber preparedness. And what's happened, I think, over the last few years is that we've moved from, how can the board be assured that there are protections in place? Because most boards, to be honest, are very well aware of the problems of it. But nowadays, the questions are moving on to, does the board really recognize that a cyber breach is probably inevitable? You're going to have to do that. And therefore, the priority for the board is to understand, in the event of that, what is the role of the board in response to that, and what are the various roles that have to be played out, and are they ready to do that if they get the call to say we've had a breach? What role does the board play? How do you release the executives to actually deal with that problem as fast as they can? How do you deal with the kind of reaching out to the investor community, to other stakeholders? How do you take some of the load of the sort of day-to-day running off the executives so they can really deal with the problem? So that's the question we're being asked, much more than have we got the right protections in place? Because that's 5 years ago, that was the key thing about cyber. Big question on everybody's lips at the moment now is AI, and does the board, understand the potential impact of AI? And this is a business model issue in general. Like, what is AI going to do to the business model of ourselves and our competitors? Again, does the board understand that? Is it confident that the executive is on top of that and that we're looking at the right things to do with AI? And, what are the risks and what are the opportunities? Because frankly, AI for many companies is the biggest opportunity that it's going to have. And I think actually, and interestingly enough, when thinking about this from a board's point of view, the new European Union AI Act is actually quite useful in the way that it sets out how to think about AI and what impact AI can have and what the implications of that are. And then I think the final thing I'd like to mention is that almost all boards are thinking about how can AI help our processes in the boardroom and make us more effective at being a board. And there are many ways you can do that. But the important thing, I think, is to consider, what are the safeguards that we require if we're going to use AI both effectively, but also from a safety point of view. And again, the EU Act on this is actually quite clear that it's important that there remains kind of human judgment within that loop, that you're not actually, you're still responsible for what happens in the company, and you can't delegate to AI to make those big decisions. But sure as hell, you can use it to help you get to those decisions more effectively. That's my technology bit. Back to you, Gillian, to talk about risk.
Thank you, Alistair. And I think, our focus is very much that the role of the board in AI governance, and absolutely that, accountability sits with the board. The second point where we're certainly seeing a very strong focus is risk calibration. And I use that term advisedly. Certainly, risk is very heightened. We're living in very uncertain times. In terms of the sort of board reviews, I think some of the more effective reviews we're having are really using the review to understand the board's risk appetite, and as part of almost calibrating the board's own risk appetite, which I think is very important. There's a clear danger of risk aversion in this world as well, and I think some chairs are perhaps concerned that their boards can be quite risk averse, and I think this is an opportunity, just in a safe environment, to really sort of stress test that concept of the board's own risk appetite, which I think is really important. There's a clear focus on the quality of the board's discussion of risk. What risk discussions are coming to the board itself? Are they the right risk discussions? Is it just a formulaic discussion of risk, or is the board actually engaging with the principal and material risks for the business? And I think that's become a very sort of focused part of board reviews. And we do see there's a sort of polarity. Some boards are circling around topics, whereas others have a very clear understanding of these are the risks, this is the link to the business model, and this is where the board discussion needs to be focused. And linked to that, horizon scanning. How can the board contribute most effectively to horizon scanning? Again, it's quite easy to have very broad, open discussions, but bringing that back to the relevance for the business bringing that back to a conversation that the CEO can do something with. That's the area that we're seeing board reviews really focus on, getting that risk conversation right. And then, Alistair, I'll hand over to you for strategy.
Back to strategy, obviously very, very closely connected to risk. Gillian mentioned on a couple of slides back that one of the things we're being increasingly asked to do is to observe the strategy day. And in association with that, we're often asked to actually look at the strategy development process, because one of the things that boards are looking at now is in a environment where things change enormously rapidly, where new technologies can completely wipe out entire parts of your supply chain. There's a need for strategy to be a lot more kind of dynamic and agile than it has been. And so one of the things that we are being asked to do now is to look at the board's process of developing strategy. Historically, the board got involved probably once a year when the executive would bring them a strategy and talk them through it, and they would approve it and review it. That kind of annual set piece thing is becoming increasingly a thing of the past, and it's generally a much more dynamic process with a lot more touch points during the development of strategy, a lot more oversight of implementation in a kind of light touch type of way. So the board is needing to think about, how do we incorporate that agility into the process, and then how, given that, do we still maintain our kind of long-term direction, and we've got a kind of North Star that actually this is what our business is doing, this is our purpose. How do we stick with that while recognizing that as new things happen within the world, we have to kind of duck and weave and make sure the strategy is being fit for purpose. So the strategy process has to be much more iterative than we've been used to. And also it requires considerable engagement, but at all the times the board has to recognize what its role is versus the executive. So it's a much more challenging strategy process, but a number of companies are easing their way towards a process which allows them to be much more kind of flexible, while maintaining good control over the actual way the strategy is put together. Gillian.
Thank you. And the final 2 points, firstly, succession planning, I've already mentioned. We've seen, certainly in the last 5 years, a much greater interrogation of the skill matrix alignment. It's become a major focus of board reviews. It always was, but it's become much more dynamic. There's much more focus on how the skill matrix is constructed, how it's disclosed, and that might be something that Hans might want to pick up on later. What's the guidance that's given to investors and shareholders on this topic? As we've touched upon, I think technology is a major driver here, but not just technology. It's very obviously understanding of the market, understanding of the sector, understanding of the competitor landscape, and particularly in this environment of geopolitical tensions, actually that sort of international expertise becomes really, really important in understanding the perspective from different markets. The quality of succession planning has also become a major focus. How does the NomCo oversee succession planning? And I think we've seen a shift from responding to individual board role or tenures rolling over, to actually thinking ahead to the shape of the board, the structure of the board, the size of the board, and really playing in a much more malleable way with how do we get contributing to that sort of judgment muscle that we were talking about. How do we make sure that we're really attracting the best possible talent to the board? And there is a competition for talent as well, I think, but obviously at executive level, but also at board level. And so I think that both the skill matrix itself, but also the process of succession planning has become a major area of focus. And then cognitive diversity. Now, much has been discussed about DE&I in the past couple of years. We've seen a very strong focus on chairs really wanting to know that they've got different perspectives and different ways of thinking in the boardroom, as one of the biggest risks is perceived as being everybody thinking the same way. And there's an elephant in the room that's missed. So I think, that's a key part of judgment and a key aspect of board reviews. And last but not least, stakeholder engagement. This is really, I guess, Fidelio's background and a really important area for us that we do probe and always have probed in board reviews. I guess what we're seeing now in board reviews is greater appetite to understand the quality of the board's knowledge of its investor base and what those investors are thinking. So, is the board really getting that feedback? Does it engage with investors? So looking at the processes underpinning it, and we would often build in also the sort of the broker feedback, the shareholder feedback, the investor feedback, so that we can see that we can calibrate that picture. I do think activism is playing a role. We've seen a major uptick in activism across Europe, and large companies and small. And I think no board wants to be compelled to take action that they know perhaps they should have addressed earlier. And I think that's really focusing the mind on, what are shareholders thinking and understanding the shareholder base. And then last but absolutely not least, the stakeholder map. We've talked actually for a number of years about the stakeholder map, and we are seeing boards adopting this as a much more practical tool. I think one, to ensure that there's just a common understanding across board members of who are the key stakeholders, what are their expectations, but also in the context of reputation risk management. This is a really important point in a fast-moving world. That a lot of scrutiny of boards, and this is an important tool to support in that regard. So that's an overview of the sort of 5 areas that we're seeing as being key focal points for board reviews now, really driven by the boards themselves. What I'd like to do is open up to 2 questions, and please do use the question function. We've got a couple coming in. I'm going to start with a question for Hans, and just perhaps really pushing that disclosure point. One of the things that we think through very clearly is the value of a review is being able to be very open and frank with the board. Now, in the annual report, that's a different format, that's a different channel of communication. Hans, could you perhaps just talk us through the shareholder understanding of different layers of disclosure? And perhaps also, if you could just add any thoughts on, you've sat on both sides of the fence, you've been an investor as a consumer of board reviews, but you've also conducted board reviews with us. So perhaps the 2 short answers on disclosure and sitting on both sides of the fence, as it were.
Yeah, so I think this disclosure is an interesting one. I'm also a lawyer, and so I see the tension between, okay, you cannot give away some sensitivities. Investors also don't want to hear confidential information about specific individuals, but it can still be done. So the one extreme is just saying we are a highly effective board with very qualified members. That's not very credible and helpful for investors. What we do see of sort of leading companies do is probably four different things. One is being clear about that's minimum expectation, who conducted it, and was it externally facilitated, and relationships with that firm. And that's actually also in the corporate governance code. Then a little bit about the scope, what's the process, and particularly how much face time or how much inside the boardroom were the external reviewers actually in practice. So what Gillian talked about earlier, were there interviews, observations can be really important, and powerful strategy day observation, again, even better. Then third, being clear about the main themes that came out of it, and so the agreed actions. So that's done by quite a few companies. Also, I think what is not done well by many companies, and the fourth point when explaining, okay, how does it all fit within the company specific circumstances and the board board's priorities. So not just explaining, okay, these were the themes, but that's what we identified because it's important for our company right now. So the strategic context. And the other question about seeing it from both sides, I mean, it just confirmed, in my view, that how much potential good, robust, rigorous board reviews have, including the interviewing. So where non-executive directors chair really start thinking when you're going through the questions and just having a very open conversation, that in itself can be powerful. And then also what people with different backgrounds can add. I mean, my background being in shareholder engagement. So what can you add to the board as an advisor, helping on specific topics, be that strategy, technology, or shareholder and stakeholder engagement. So I think very positive, the experience from the other side as well.
Thank you very much. Now we're getting a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and answer them. I have a question. I'm going to turn it to Alistair now. How do you assess the climate, I guess the working climate, the dynamic at board level within the board review priorities? And perhaps you can just talk through, Alistair, how we would go about that.
Yeah, I mean, the dynamic in the boardroom is incredibly important. You can find, we have seen boards with lots of incredibly skilled people with all the right skill mix and all this kind of stuff, but the dynamic is not good for whatever reason. They don't get on. They talk over each other and things. So the tools that we have for that, I mean, firstly, a lot of this comes out during a good open interview, because if there are issues, that will be a clear subject that will come up during the interviews. But obviously, the most direct way of looking at that is through observation. And one of the things, I think Gillian picked this up, is that I think boards themselves are increasingly understanding the value of having somebody, if you like, sitting on the side of the boardroom, not participating in the boardroom, but observing how the dynamic works. And very often you can see as an outsider quite quickly some of the causes of friction around the boardroom. And sometimes, to be honest, it may well be that the chair is just not, is not performing the chair's function. So in some cases, we come out of a board evaluation saying, well, actually, the chair could have intervened within what became a very sticky debate simply by chairing that debate better. So I'd say the tools that I would pick up as being most important are the interviews, because they're open. You get all the gripes come out of that, and then secondly, through the observations would be the way that you can really start picking away that dynamic. And I think the dynamic, as I think was actually on the question that came up on the screen, is, I completely agree, one of the most important elements of an effective board.
Thank you. We've had a question, which perhaps I'll answer because we are slightly running out of time, on the requirement to assess individual board members. And of course, I think in any review, you're obviously looking at the collective and the combination of individuals. And in any review, you'll obviously look at how key board roles are performed. So you're covering that. But the code does actually, the UK code and other codes as well, does actually set out an expectation of looking at the contribution of individual board members. And one additional tool, perhaps just picking up on Alistair's last point, that we've developed is an attribute analysis, which is essentially a peer review tool for board members, but it's really looking at the attributes of being an effective board member. And it's obviously very sensitively structured and conducted, but it's proved a really useful tool. It supplements the skills matrix. It provides a different dimension for the chair to think about, the composition of the board. And also it can help, picking up on the dynamic point, it can really highlight, if you have a board that's very, very strong on governance and finance, but there are perhaps other gaps, or very strong on strategy, but less so on risk, for example. So I think that there are different ways and means, and certainly board reviews are evolving towards a much more tailored. This would also result in individual reports for individual board members and potentially individual pathways as well, really responding to the question on individual evaluation of individual directors. Now, I've got a question here which I'd like to address to both Hans and Alistair, and that's on AI, coming back to our subject. At a time when AI will change everything, what should be the maximum tenure for a chair and non-execs? Are there any reasons to go beyond that period? So a challenging question, and I'd welcome perhaps, Hans, just your thoughts on the implications of AI for tenure.
Yeah, interesting question. I think in general, I think having a 9-year view on tenure is, I think you need to go case by case. I think it's a very short answer. And the fact that sometimes, I mean, the argument being, okay, maybe non-executive directors and chair find more time than executives to devote to AI and getting up to speed for it. So my short answer is probably we should, as investors, just reflect more on what makes sense for the company, but then also assessing the individual in with board evaluations, but also in conversations we're having and assessing the ability to learn. So I wouldn't have or recommend a specific number, but make it very much sort of case by case, because there are also clear advantages of having longer tenure. So again, it cuts both ways.
Yes, the blend of the two, I think, is really important. I don't know, Alistair, if you've got any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with Hans on this, and I think also, you don't necessarily, just because, I agree that the technology is changing, it can change your business model, all sorts of things, but the role of a chair can actually sit over that. A chair that's been there for 9 years, but is very, very good at understanding what is required from the board and how to chair that company can be extremely valuable, even if the technology is changing underneath them. So I think it's a case by case basis. There are clearly reasons why you want a chair with some history and some experience and some knowledge of the people around the board table. So I certainly wouldn't say, we want to really go to rapid chair turnover in order to address the AI problem. I think that'll give you more problems than you would solve.
But we are seeing rapid learning on AI. So to pick
I mean,
up that point, going back to Alistair's earlier point, I do think
that's a different point. Yeah,
that
I think
rapid upskilling is critical, and it might be in different ways.
Yeah, and there's other ways of doing it. So a chair might decide that actually, to keep on top of AI, we need to put together a committee or an advisory board or something that's going to keep us live while we upskill our board members. So there are lots of ways about it, I think.
And we are seeing that pipeline of chairs with real technology experience, it being analysed across, well, certainly across Europe. I mean, it's a really good question. So thank you for raising it. In the interest of time, we've had a question about ensuring that, or working with the company to ensure that recommendations are implemented, including perhaps less, comfortable or sensitive recommendations. And I think, my response to this would be multi-layered. The process is initially feedback is delivered to the chair and perhaps the chair of or members of the nomination committee, and there's the opportunity for sort of a real open discussion in that context, then shared with the board as a whole. We also create trackers to support in the implementation of the recommendations, and do remain very close and provide a sounding board. I think also, this is a particular, we've recently published an article on SID lid and vice chairs. And I think also we do find that this can be an area where that sort of relationship between chairs and SIDs can be really, really helpful if there are themes that need thinking through. That sounding board role, that additional capability or capacity of the SID can be, or lid in other jurisdictions, can be very important. And another question I'd like to come back perhaps to Alistair here is the observation is made that a really good strategic conversation was about risk and evaluating the appetite for risk and opportunity. Is it something that we're seeing that in our board reviews, that sort of really good risk discussion? So perhaps just reflecting, I guess our observations are multi-layered on risk, but perhaps Alistair, a thought, and then Hans, if there's anything that you'd like to add there.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure what's being asked here. I mean, risk is obviously an extremely important part of any, the oversight of risk, and how well it's being done is an extremely important part of what we do in the board evaluation. And we do almost always observe, as well as observing board conversations on risk, we observe the conversations that are taking place in the risk committee and in the board, either in the audit committee, if the audit committee is handling risk for the board, or in cases where there's a separate risk committee, the risk committee as well. So, one of the things I think you can do is get a very good idea from those observations, plus from the kind of materials review and the interviews, as to how well risk is being handled throughout the system. The three kind of degrees of risk management. And so I'm not sure whether I've answered the question, but I think we do very specifically look at how risk is handled at the various levels to understand whether we feel that it's being handled appropriately.
Yes, it's both the process of risk, but also the quality, I think, of the discussion of risk.
Yeah, I think that's from the observation you can get.
Yeah. And I think what we're finding is, boards are either feeling that they're grappling with the right risks, or that the conversation's not happening in the boardroom. And I think that's sort of one of the areas that we're really exploring. Is it a boardroom discussion? I'd like to just perhaps address one question that's come up, and it's, have we got examples, anonymous, of where a board review has improved the board and company performance? And I think the methodology supports this. We would typically identify 5 or 6 areas where, if the board focuses on these areas, that will really drive the performance of the board and performance of the company, and then a means of tracking. But we also, and this was interesting, pushed by private equity, how would you actually do that? So we then sort of really kind of break it down practically, how you could implement those areas. And I think some of the areas where we've seen companies that we've worked with make tremendous strides is indeed around the strategy process. Sort of, one board review, and often we will have sort of, 2-3 reviews that we can map the sort of the progress over. One review will focus on the board's readiness to move forward on strategy, the timing, the pace, and that we can see significant progress in the feedback from the review, which has influenced, I guess, how quickly the board has moved forward and the company has moved forward. 3 or 4 years later, you can see a real sort of progress in terms of execution of strategy, and ideally also in articulation of strategy, and valuation as well. So we can see that sort of mechanism working really well. I think the other area I would highlight is it's a really good mechanism for skills matrix, and quite often we see that as a consequence of a board review, this provides a framework for moving ahead with the composition of the board and identifying the profiles that are needed, and just moving ahead, both in terms of perhaps bringing refreshment into the board, but also perhaps also the sort of population of committees, for example. So those would be 2 areas where we've definitely seen, very clear evidence. I don't know, Alistair, if there's anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that one, I mean, maybe it's because we see it better, but I do, we have several clients where we have done, a number of reviews, and we were talking about boards thinking about this kind of 3-year board enhancement process rather than thinking of it as a review every 3 years. And where we have worked with boards, starting off with a full review, and then worked with them on some of these interventions during the process to help ensure that they're moving forward in the right direction and kind of course correcting things. Those have been very successful. So we've seen a number of very successful companies where we have maybe done a couple of the big external reviews, but also have touch pointed with them in the periods between them to help them get a kind of independent view of, well, how well are you really doing? Have you really tackled the problems that were highlighted in the review? So I would just add that, I think, in terms of something which kind of can differentiate a board that's likely to be successful if they have a mindset that the board review is part of a longer term board enhancement process, and that they think about it in that way.
Thank you. And I think, Hans, I guess you would also be looking to see that reflection, that journey in the disclosure relating to the review. I think you made that point very, very eloquently earlier on. I am going to have to draw we've come to the top of the hour, and I'm going to have to draw the webinar to a close. If we could move on to the next chart. This is simply a summary of the key points that we've raised, and we are happy to share this. So, but really working through the structural changes, the shift from effectiveness to performance, and the key focal areas of technology competence, risk calibration, and balancing pace and long-term strategic direction. In terms of future events, if we could just move to the next chart, please. We have a technology webinar in June on looking at exactly that subject, technology competence in the boardroom. Also, what high-performing boards do differently. And then we'll have a geopolitical roundtable just before the US midterms, very bravely, in October. So looking at the board and geopolitical risk. I'd like to thank you all for your participation, the great questions. We've really enjoyed the discussion today. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Hans and Alistair, for tackling quite a big subject area. We'd love to hear from you. And if there are further questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. And if you would like the material, please just contact us and we will follow up. But many thanks to all of you, and thanks to my colleagues as well. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.